Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of the Asclepius podcast, where we talk all things medicine and science with your host, Timothy Chu. Now, at the time of recording this podcast, I've just recently gotten over my cold, and I'm also getting an interview tomorrow for a position that I've been interested in for a while, so yay, a moment of celebration. Anyway, for today's podcast, we have guest speaker Dr. Shirag Shemmassian, owner of Shemmassian Academic Consulting. After a fun story to introduce Dr. Shemmassian, we will go over topics such as why Dr. Shemmassian decided to pursue the path of becoming an academic advisor, whether we should comment on mental health in our applications, what the purpose of an academic consultant is, and what they even do, and so much more. Please don't forget to like, comment, rate, subscribe, share, and all that good stuff. It really helps the algorithm and will get the information out quicker. Regardless, hope you all enjoy. Oh, hi there. So before we start today's episode, let's go over our sponsor, us. Now, if you are dying to part with your hard-earned cash, then feel free to support us on patreon.com/the Asclepius podcast. That's TheAsclepius podcast. Perks include being able to ask questions to future guests, suggesting future guests, getting cool original merchandise, and so much more. Hopefully, this is the first season, so we don't know how it's all going to play out, but either way. And once again, visit our patreon.com/the Asclepius podcast, or visit us at asclepiuspodcast.wixsite.com/home. Eventually, we'll try to get our own domain too. Anyway, look forward to seeing you soon. Are you extremely gifted? Do you have complete mastery over the arts? Well, my friends, if you are literally Leonardo da Vinci, DiCaprio, reincarnated, I would highly encourage you to participate in the seasonal Asclepius Podcast Art Challenge, where we have but the most able of artistic maestros submit their rendition of the Rod of Asclepius. Those that happen to edge out their competition will have their art not only used as our logo for the season, but will also have their art used as merchandise, with all the proceeds of that merchandise donated to Children's Hospital. How altruistic of you. If you are interested in showcasing your amazing talents or just helping out Children's Hospital or the podcast, then feel free to submit your art at our website at asclepiuspodcast.wixsite.com/home. Anyway, let's get back to the episode. So let's just picture this. You're a scared little man applying for medical school. At this point of your life, money is sort of scarce. So scarce, in fact, that your wallet is tethered to your belt, for fear that it will be overcome by the buoyancy force of air. Investing in a medical school application advisor is like way out of the picture, but you need any help you can get, so you decide to start searching for some answers on good old YouTube. Is it bad if I email the school for an update on my applications? What even is the application process? Why even is the application process? Is there anything that I'm missing? You start feeling the weight of not being good enough. You feel doubt coursing through your mind. You feel weak for feeling, and then you start feeling weak for feeling that you're weak for feeling. You quietly cry out, I wish someone would just give me a chance. But you're a fighter, and so you move on. You compose yourself and happen across a video where a man with dark curly hair and an ever-inviting smile says, it's going to be okay. And in that moment, those little words of encouragement just makes you feel a little more prepared and ready to take your next steps. It makes you feel like you're not alone. Now, surprise, surprise, the scared little man is me, or at least was me, and that other man with the dark curly hair and the ever-inviting smile is today's guest, Dr. Shirag Shemmassian. I was fortunate to have found Dr. Shemmassian's content and advice exactly when I happened to need it. It was roughly after my 7th medical school rejection, where I felt that perhaps it may be best to submit my application for a review and see what I was potentially doing wrong. Within that same email, I also added a little side remark asking Dr. Shemmassian if he would be interested in joining the podcast, and he graciously agreed. I believe that today's episode has a lot of helpful nuggets to unpack for anyone trying to get into medical school, and I honestly cannot wait for you all to hear the bars that Dr. Shemmassian is about to spit. Anyway, with that all being said, Dr. Shirag Shemmassian, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Shemmassian. I primarily help students get into medical school. I've been doing this work for a long, long time, primarily through, pre-med advising with, assisting with course selection and extracurricular development, and all the way through MCAT tutoring and comprehensive application support. And it's something that I've just, grown to increasingly fall in love with. A little more about me on a personal side. So I'm a Los Angelino, born and raised. I know before we started recording here, Tim, I was telling you about being a giant Laker fan, and we're recording this in early 2022. So I'm not an excited Laker fan at the moment, but I'm always optimistic that we'll turn it around. So it's just really nice to be here.
I was wondering how you went from the traditional pre-med route, going into that, and then eventually finding yourself saying, maybe I don't want to go into medicine. How did that all go about for you?
Yeah, it's a loaded question. And thank you for asking it, because, it wasn't pre-planned. I think a lot of us, when we're growing up, we have this clear vision for ourselves, right? Or at least we think we do. We're going to go to this great school for undergrad. We're going to then go to medical school. We're going to become this kind of surgeon and all this kind of stuff. And, sometimes it's comes from inside. It comes from within us. Sometimes it's sort of dictated to us. It might be a parent who told us, well, here are the choices, doctor, dentist, engineer, whatever. I sometimes laugh and call that the immigrant menu. Like if you have immigrant parents, you're sort of given some options and you're like, all right, I guess these are the options. And I always loved healthcare. When I was a little kid, I would read, anatomy books and all this kind of stuff. And it was just a major interest of mine. And, I excelled in the sciences in school. And I was, a science major in college. And I ended up, wrapping up at Cornell as a human development major. My concentration was neurological development, so essentially brain development. And as I was going through school, I was becoming increasingly fascinated with mental health conditions and neurological conditions and so on. And having grown up with Tourette syndrome, I was sort of always personally curious about this kind of stuff. And then as I was taking more coursework and doing more research on the side of neurology and mental health and neuroscience in general, I just started getting deeper and deeper down that rabbit hole. I had done very well. I had a 3.9 at Cornell and was gearing up to apply. And I think I would have been successful had I gone through with it. But I realized I know what I want to do. I know I want to specialize in assisting people with mental health conditions. I would likely become a psychiatrist if I went into medical school. But I realized that there was a more direct path to doing that. And so a PhD in clinical psych offered that opportunity to me. Whereas, if I had gone to medical school, I'd have to still learn more about, bones and the heart and, all these kinds of stuff that obviously I found interesting, but not to the same degree. And that was really the story of it. But even within clinical psychology, I was staying pretty true to, the neurosciences. I was doing a lot of work in brain imaging, development of ADHD in the brain and sex differences and all these kinds of things. And then doing work in diagnostic algorithms, so involving a lot of stats. So I was still very deep, working with physicians all the time and doing my internships and all these kinds of residencies in hospital settings and so on. I never saw it as not being involved in medicine. It was just a different sort of angle in the medical field. The admission side is a little more interesting. It's sort of like a bug I had that never left me. So going back to these immigrant parents that I have, they had high expectations for me as far as going to great schools, going to, great graduate programs and, doing very well career-wise and all this kind of stuff, but they did not have the blueprint on how to make that happen, right? So they started their higher education in Lebanon, where they immigrated from, and so they didn't really know how to write essays or the SAT and the ACT and all this kind of stuff. And so my brother and I were self-taught in this process, and so we were able to achieve our own successes. My brother actually ended up going to medical school after UCLA for undergrad. And so he's an pediatric emergency physician by training. And so it was something where I had to learn it myself. And I also came from a low to middle income background. And it's not like we had resources to hire a consultant or anything like that. But we were self-taught if we want to make it happen. I also learned how to get a ton of scholarships and graduated debt-free. And it was interesting, Tim, when I was having success, there were a lot of people coming up to me essentially saying, you know, oh, like, how'd you do it? Could you help me too? I have these aspirations too. So there are all these people who like had high aspirations, but didn't know necessarily where to turn. Cause I grew up in basically an all Armenian community in LA, and I was helping people. Then they started telling their friends and their cousins and so on. And it's just kind of a word of mouth thing, something I did as a labor of love. Over time, what ended up happening is, one, my interest in it was growing. I sort of loved sort of what's behind the curtain with the admissions process. It feels a little bit secretive. And so I think that was always intriguing to me, like what goes on behind closed doors kind of thing. And it's actually very true. It is intriguing in that way. But then also I started noticing that I was fielding the same questions over and over again. What should I write about in my personal statement? What's a good interview? Who should I get rec letters from? Yada, yada. And I found myself like, okay, I feel like I'm answering these same questions over and over again. I wish people had a good resource to, review prior to talking to me. And, I'm talking 7 to 10 years ago, there just wasn't anything good online. As far as, if you search something, you'd get like 5 tips, here are 5 tips to write a personal statement, be yourself. Everyone else is taken, and these kinds of things. And so I noticed that this wasn't valuable to people. And so I was like, you know what, I'll just start writing stuff. I'll send it to people. And something very interesting happened. Mind you, I have no business training. I have no SEO or computer science or website training or anything like that. It's all self-taught now. But I started writing about it. And I remember getting an email from someone completely random on the internet. And they were like, hey, I'm interested in your services. And I was like, who are you? And how did you find me? Because you're not a cousin of anyone. You're not anyone's friend that I know. And they're like, oh, I just found your stuff online when I Googled it. I was like, what? Because, when you don't know how SEO works and how to show up in Google, it's just kind of one of those things. You just assume stuff exists and whatever. You don't realize that someone's putting it out there, and there's a way that, Google, figures out what they should feature and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, that's interesting. And, that was a time for me when I was like, I'm getting really excited about discussing this stuff and essentially unlocking the mystery behind the admissions process. And our students are being very successful when I help them. And I was like, well, I feel like I'm doing good work and there's a lot of demand and I enjoy it. And so I just started writing more and more and more. And over time got more and more sophisticated with all these different areas, including on the SEO side of things. And that's just kind of how it grew. We don't spend $1 on advertising. It's all word of mouth and the quality of our content. And that's something that I've lived by. So I realized that's a little bit of a longer story about how I got here, but it was just organic. I did it because I needed to learn it. And then I helped others and loved it more and more over time. And as it grew and, our students were finding success, I just found myself increasingly drawn to it. And here I am today.
When you were at that fork in the road where you were like, oh man, I can go into medical school, which is your brother older or younger?
He's older. He's 3 years older. Yeah.
So then you had an added pressure of, oh, I should probably go into medical school because of the immigrant layout, your brother. But then you decided somehow in that very moment to go into psychology because that is where your passions lay. What was that whole experience like? Did you find support from your family? And how did you even navigate communicating that with your family of like, oh, I'm not going the route that we all thought I was?
It's funny you ask because, in hindsight, when you look at the way it all shakes out and when people see that you're doing well, career-wise, et cetera, it's like, haha, like, of course, like no big deal. But in the moment, it's really stressful. When your parents have an expectation for you and you've been telling people your whole life, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. And when you have that expectation for yourself, you've been working towards it. It's very jarring for everyone when you make that switch. Like I knew deep down that it was the right decision because that's where my interests were, and that I would really enjoy it. But it was very difficult, especially for my dad, right? I remember him saying like, how long, what? PhD? Like, how long is this program? I was like, 5 to 7 years, depending on how fast you complete it. He's like, but why would you do this? Like, Med school is like 4 years and the residency is like 3 4. It's like it's the same time. I was like, well, it's not a plan B. It's not because I'm not getting, it's because it's a different thing that I want to do more. My mom, I think my mom just has a general, and I love her for this. Like she just generally trusts me. Like, oh, I trust you to, figure it out. I'm sure there's a good reason behind it or whatever. And then, I talked to her about, yeah, and, it's fully funded. And oh, she's like, that's nice because, your older brother has a lot of loans and all this kind of stuff. So I think they were just like kind of warming up. But I'm also a little bit stubborn in that way. Like, if I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to do this thing. And it's not like people are necessarily going to stop me. And that's worked well, in my favor. But at the time, that's not the only decision that I've made, that was different from my expected path. Like, when I started my PhD, I thought that, I would one day become a faculty member somewhere, or be a university president or whatever. And then I thought I would go into neuropsychology and do that kind of assessment work clinically. And then I started getting into diagnostics. So I went away from that. I got a job after grad school. And then at some point, I left that job and, started doing this work full time. So there were a series of very difficult decisions to get here. It wasn't like no med school, but all of a sudden I ended up as a consultant, right? Like there were a lot of key decisions at various points. And this is important for, people to think about as they're making their decision, not just about medical school, but other stuff too. Make decisions based on the information you have at that moment. Sometimes we wish that we have it all figured out. I would go to this school, I would do residency at this place, I would marry this person, I would settle here, you can make those plans, but life has a funny way of steering you in different directions. Your interests change over time, so make decisions based on the variables you have at the moment, right? And don't think about, well, but in 4 years, well, all this kind of stuff. That's something that I've sort of trusted my gut along the way, and that doesn't mean it hasn't been difficult. It just means that when I knew deep down, yeah, in the moment, like, this is what I know, this is how I feel. Yes, I thought I would always do this thing, but that's not jiving with where my head's at right now, or where my heart is right now. And following that decision-making style has been great for me.
I just think that it's really cool to have people come out and talk about their successful journeys to medicine, but also in other areas, especially unexpected areas of research and pursuit, because, as Dr. Shemmassian stated, life is one heck of a ride, and you never really know how it's all going to play out until after the fact. You bring up your love for psychology and learning about the brain and imaging. And I'm assuming you're a nerd, like most of us who are listening 100%. To the podcast.
Yeah, 100%.
Has there been anything that you learned in your PhD program where you're like, whoa, I use this a lot more than I thought I would, and it's so applicable in my interactions with students?
Yeah. Sometimes people ask me like, oh, like, do you feel like you let psychology go? Do you ever use it in your work? Absolutely. Probably the stuff that sticks with me the most is just, this might sound very basic, but I'll say it anyway. Just like reflecting and validating how people feel, I think is very important, because a lot of times I've observed like students, and, I see this a lot in the pre-med community in particular, people want answers. They don't like gray areas. I'm generalizing here, but a lot of pre-med students do not like gray areas. They like black and white. Is my score good enough? Is my GPA there? Do I need this guy? What if I wrote my essay about this? Is this a good topic? Is this a bad topic? It's very black and white kinds of questions. And something like admissions is inherently so gray. You can do so many things perfectly and still not get in, or not into the school or whatever. And so, one of the things that I feel very comfortable in, just generally speaking, is a gray area in life. I'm okay with things not being black and white. So, it's one of those situations where, I think a lot about, okay, students are going through a lot and they're looking for answers, and they want to go through all this. They want to go through their list of questions, but let's just sit with it for a moment. Let's sit with, how are you feeling about this? Where's your head at? What are some of your current concerns as a prospective reapplicant? What do you think happened? Why is that? Just sitting and listening, and yeah, that sucks that you're going through this. It's a real, but that just really connecting with people, I think, is important, because sometimes we get lost in the weeds of all the to-dos of the application process, that we forget that there's someone who's just experiencing emotional highs and lows, and it's just a kind of crazy thing. I mean, if you want a nerdy, psychology term, we can think about, a locus of control, right? So this might have come up in an MCAT prep. So external versus internal locus of control. Like, do I have control over my account, or is it just like wherever the wind blows me with the admissions process? Because it can sometimes feel like you're powerless. You're kind of naked, right? You take your courses, you have your stats, you write your essays, you got your rec letters, your school list, and then you're naked. They're, behind closed doors, evaluating you, no control. You're like, this is fixed, anyway, I have no chance. And, I'm part of a ORM group, not a URM group. And yeah, my stats are this, but it's not like that. Always, someone's always better than me. It can feel so helpless. And I tell students, I get that. There are variables completely outside of your control, like how the person's feeling that day. But our students have gotten in with a great track record over the years that it's not quite random. And so there is a lot in our power, including the story we tell about ourselves through essays and so on. And I just want to make sure that students feel that they buy into that, because if you don't believe it, you're not going to try, right? If you believe that something is not possible, the person you ask on a date say yes or something like that, you're either not going to try or you're going to do a poor job at it, right? And so I think buying into the possibility is just really encouraging for a lot of people.
Talking about trying and buying into the possibility, I recently had to exercise this muscle myself when I asked my girlfriend to be my Valentine. And, well, she agreed. Now, I was super nervous, especially since it felt a little quick. I mean, we've only dated for 2 years. Anyway, to comment on these sage words of advice by Dr. Shemmassian, the concept of internal and external locus of control is so interesting to me. I've recently read The Art of Living, which is essentially a compilation of Stoic philosophy by Epictetus, and I particularly enjoyed the concept, in layman's terms, that life and its events is not what makes us sad or happy, but rather it's our interpretation of life and its events that ultimately have the power to make us sad or happy. So, having an internal locus of control and constantly reiterating that in your students seems like a good bit of advice to get you through. Also, wanted to just note how cool it is that Dr. Shemmassian automatically ditched the jargon and went for the concept of simply being with another person in the moment. And as I'm constantly learning day in and day out, just because a concept is simple does not mean it is trivial. So basically just another thing to add to my daily pursuits. Another thing that you talked about was your Tourette's. And I think that that's a really interesting topic, because one of the videos that I watched of yours that I found a lot of inspiration from was your healthy approach to dealing with Tourette's, and not just dealing with it, but communicating it with people. Has that experience helped you in helping students? And in general, how has that helped you just become the person that you are today?
Yeah, huge influence. When I was 8 or 9 years old, when I started first exhibiting these kinds of tics, I grew up, like I said, in a setting where, my parents might not have been as familiar. There wasn't really like a, acceptance within my community about, various neurological conditions or mental health conditions or whatever the case might be. And so people would, call it a bad habit, snap out of it, all this kind of stuff. It was pretty discouraging, honestly. And I remember seeing multiple physicians, and it took like the third or fourth person who immediately knew what it was, but others just like kind of made up all these answers and diagnoses and all this kind of stuff. And for me, it was really cool to know that there was a label, there was a thing that explained it. And I knew sort of the prognosis, and I knew how serious it was or wasn't, and all this kind of stuff. And so that just gave me, a really nice, I think, sense of peace when I found out that it was just a thing, and, as I grew up with it, there were different periods of life where it was harder, right? So during adolescence, a lot of tics can exacerbate and so on. So high school was a little bit harder, getting teased, all this kind of stuff. and teachers saying, you're not going to amount to anything, you're making excuses. There are some pretty horrible things said, legitimately horrible things said. And I don't know, to me, I just think it was very motivating in that I have when people, I'm the kind of person who, like, you tell me I can't and I'll do it kind of thing. And to me, it was like, all right, sounds good. I'm going to prove, this person wrong, or I'll show them, or whatever the case might be. I think that, to a degree, that's healthy, having that fire. You don't want to always be, you don't want to just be motivated by proving people wrong, of course, but having some of that fire, I think, is really valuable. And the reason I talk about it a lot is not just to help people with Tourette syndrome. Because I think people with Tourette syndrome, I think more often than not, don't go to college, or certainly don't graduate. And there are actually no differences in, like, intelligence and all that kind of stuff, right? So people are capable. It's just whether due to social stigma or difficulties managing or whatever the case might be, they just sort of, like, don't achieve what they're capable of. And so I always just thought, if I can put it out there and normalize these things and show people you can be just fine and do all right, in spite or because of this kind of thing, perhaps my message will inspire other people. Because there's always excuses and reasons we can come up with, about why we're not going to do X or Y or Z, right? That comes up all the time. But it's our job to, like, take the reins and say, you know what, damn the statistics. Right. I don't care. Like, I believe I'm going to make it happen, and I need to buy into that story, and so that's my hope for putting the story out there.
Damn the statistics. That has to be the quote of the day. I just love that goosebump-inducing fire that people get when they're driven. When it seems that it would literally take everything to stop that individual, and you honestly sort of believe them.
In that video that you were talking about your Tourette's, you talk about an anecdotal experience where someone said, "Hey, don't cuss me out," and your wife was not too happy with it.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that maybe when you were younger, you might have had that response of, like, yo, that's a jerk move. Like, why are you saying that to me?
Sure.
But I feel like within that response, you were able to sort of look at it and be like, it's okay. Like, let's just communicate it out.
Yep.
When did you eventually start transitioning into that thing of, maybe let's not fight fire with fire, but start, like, watering it a bit and, like, mellow it out, educationally bring it up?
When you're in junior high school, people say nasty things. And so I think I got really good at quipping back, and coming up with sharp responses or whatever the case might be. But it was really in college where I think I was just, like, getting more and more comfortable in my own skin, and people, like, making friends from, like, different backgrounds. And I just felt like, I was part of a community that was maybe a little bit more receptive overall, and started talking about it, but also growing in my education and learning about, like, how some of these things come up, and feeling more comfortable about, like, something is, I guess, technically wrong with me. I put wrong in quotes, but that doesn't mean that it's a big problem, right? And so this is the kind of thing that I wanted to educate people on, because there are also so many misconceptions, right? Like, it was around the time when I was going to college where Tourette was also kind of getting more popular in the media. You'd have characters on TV shows or in movies who would, cuss uncontrollably. And so I think there were just, like, some natural sort of opportunities to tell people about, like, actually, that's a pretty rare symptom or whatever. And so, what is that like? Does it hurt? Blah, blah. Like, people ask me all these kinds of questions. And so it's just a comfortable way for me to talk about all these different things. I guess I probably just, like, grew older and stopped caring as much about what people thought. I'm not quite sure, but I would say around college is when I started getting more comfortable talking about it.
And this talk about destigmatization, like demystifying processes. One of the most common things I hear in medical school or in pre-med students, the fear of talking about mental health, especially within just STEM in general or in career pathways. It's always a terrifying thing to bring up something that can be seen as a liability to a potential professor or admissions committee member or employer. And you go on, like, websites and you go on Reddit and people are saying, oh, totally talk about your mental health. Like, there's a lot of resources and it's really, like, if it helped you get into medical school and pursue that, go for it. But then you have other people who are saying, generalize it. You don't have to put it down. You don't want to litter your application with red flags. Have you realized, oh, talking about mental health might be a better thing or a bad thing to do on your application?
No, it's not a black and white thing. Again, one of these classic application things. Well, should I or should I not? The answer is maybe, or it depends, which everyone hates, but I like. So what does it depend on? Number one, what is the condition? That matters. So like, there are going to be different stigmas associated with different things. So talking about Tourette syndrome is probably more acceptable, or more accepted, I should say, than, I don't know, disclosing that you have bipolar disorder or something like that. That's going to be considered a more serious mental illness rather than a neurological condition, that kind of thing. And by the way, this is not a judgment on my part, just about sort of in our population, how the average person is going to view the severity of one or the other. That's what I'm saying. So what you're disclosing matters. The other thing that I will say is you have to ask yourself, what is the point? And I don't mean like, what's the point of that? Why would you even talk? That's not what I mean. It's what is your goal? What's your point in sharing this or disclosing this condition? Because if the point is, well, it was harder for me. Look how much harder it was for me. Not good enough. But if the goal is to say, here's my experience and the perspective it gave me, and how this is how I've applied that perspective to help other people, that can be very powerful. And so it just depends on how you're going to use it, rather than should I or should I not. What's the point? Why do you need to talk about that? Yes, certainly it was meaningful in your life, but is it required to deliver the theme of your application story? If the answer is yes, great. The answer is no, we need to talk some more. And that's how I think about it.
Another gray area.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I had a question about a very controversial topic. I know we sort of prefaced the meet today, but it's about this concept of reverse discrimination. Do you see reverse discrimination as a thing that is present in medical school? And if it was, do you think that it's okay to sort of quote unquote hurt an identifiable subgroup over another so that we can have a more diverse healthcare?
Yeah, this is such a complex question. And, no matter how you discuss it, there will be, there are some comments we get in that on our article on med school acceptance rates by race. And there seems to be a lot of anger, on both sides about this, oftentimes. So just to back up a little bit and get a little bit more granular, the sort of the overarching or the most common thing you see is like, well, if you're part of certain overrepresented groups, ORM groups, whether, you identify as Asian or white or all this kind of stuff, the stats, the average stats of accepted students tend to be higher than members of certain other groups, URM or underrepresented minority groups, whether it's, Black or Native American or that kind of, or people who identify with those groups. And so the controversy is essentially like, is it easier for one group and is it harder for one group? And if so, is this fair? Is it not fair? All this kind of stuff, right? So medical schools will officially say, no, holistic admissions, we consider everything. And that's a catch-all. I think when people say, they're like, yeah, we get it, you think about everything. But there's a little bit of an eye roll, if we're being honest, of like, yeah, holistic, we know what that means. It's going to be harder for me. It's going to be easier for this group or whatever the case might be. You start hearing this kind of rhetoric. And so, but if you look at the stats, I get it. Like if you're, we know just data wise that the average, GPA and MCAT score for an accepted Asian applicant is going to be higher than, the average stats of an applicant from a different background. And those are just facts. The data shows that time and time again. And so are there higher expectations? I mean, sure. I mean, you can come to that conclusion. But then you start looking a little bit deeper and you look at, well, how does maybe income play into this kind of stuff? Certain groups that are ORM, do they on average have higher income? All this kind of stuff. Or the groups that are URM, do they on average have lower income? Well, how does that affect opportunities and the way we should evaluate these profiles, et cetera? We're also generalizing, right? There are members of URM groups that are high income. There are members of ORM groups that are low income. So it gets very complicated very quickly. And then, and so there's a lot of anger about like, God, why is it hard? It should be, the smartest person in the room. Because if I'm going to ask my doctor to, diagnose cancer or perform a surgery, I don't care about the color of their skin. I just want them to be the smartest, person in the room, or whatever the case might be. And then, usually the flip as well, like it's important to have diversity. It's not all about the best test scores and all this kind of stuff. Patients from different backgrounds want to be seen by physicians who look like them. There's a lot of value in that. There's going to be maybe higher rates of like trust or treatment adherence or whatever the case might be. Or even younger people seeing, oh, there are doctors who look like me. When I was growing up, there weren't doctors who looked like me, and that's valuable to drawing people to the field. So my position is, look, my job is to help people get into medical school, period. And so my job is to not say, oh, you're from this background, you got to do it this way. You're from this background, now you'll be fine. I don't treat it that way. I treat it as like, hey, let's get that out of the picture for a moment. And let's get back to basics. What qualities do you want to communicate in your application? What do you want them to walk away with, irrespective of your ethnic or racial background? And if you talk, the more personal you get, the more you go into your more innermost thoughts and feelings, most meaningful experiences, your interactions with diverse people, and the way that's shaped you, your personal ethnicity starts becoming less of a factor because you've shown them more as a person who you are. And I will say too, we support more Asian students than students from any other group. And, and that's not super surprising, like given that, Asian students apply at high rates to medical school, so do white students and all that kind of stuff. But our students get in at very high rates. And if it were the case where it was, especially difficult for one group or another, I don't think the track record would have, shaken out the way it has. So I'm pretty proud of our students for honestly being willing to go there, so to speak, and talking about their background, getting personal in their applications, and really internalizing that, yeah, it is possible for them too, despite what the numbers might suggest, and so on and so forth. So my intention is not to pick a side or anything like that, but it's to support students with getting in. And initiative we launched in the fall of last year too is we pledged $100,000 to initiatives that promote diversity for support for students from low-income backgrounds and ethnic minority backgrounds, with offering, partial financial aid to students who qualify for the family assistance program, a bunch of initiatives, writing more guides to serve students who might not have access to great materials. We have all of the MCAT content you would ever need. You don't even need to buy a book. It's all free on our site. So these are some things that we've taken or things we've done to promote equity in the field and to develop great future doctors, regardless of color of skin or whatever.
I've recently done a lot of research on this because I wanted to have a healthier and more broadened perspective on the whole thing, because I have a lot of people who come to me under the table and they're like, yeah, dude, it must be rough because you're a ORM. And I'm like, huh? And I really never saw it that way, because I felt like for me to complain about the statistical quote unquote unfairness in like this one weird year of my life where I'm applying to medical school while completely disregarding the statistical unfairnesses that compounded for someone since they were born to application seems a bit hypocritical to me. And I think that if people get into the position, I celebrate for them. And whenever I get there, I hope they celebrate for me. And it's sing kumbaya. Obviously, it's a little more vulnerable and painful if
of course,
dedicated so much time into your application, but it's totally a fun process.
Of course. And, I've noticed too over the years, Tim, I should end by saying, the generalization is ORM, higher stats, harder for them, URM, lower stats. That's not always the case. I know plenty of students who are URM or who identify as coming from a URM background who are have ridiculously high stats, exceptionally capable, just as much as everyone else, despite odds, despite all these kind of. And so I also encourage people not to box folks up. Oh, you look like this, you must have XYZ background, all this kind of stuff. And getting to know people and understanding what they bring to the table. And that's what really I hope for the quote unquote holistic admissions process.
When we talk about the admissions process in general, or the application cycle, I think especially mental health fluctuates during the application process.
Sure.
Especially since we're sort of like this weird unified organism where we have Reddit all connecting us. Do you have a suggestion for students, and how often do you deal with that side of application process?
Every day. Students get a lot of bad advice. They compare themselves to people on SDN and Reddit. I'm not saying SDN's all good or all bad, or Reddit's all good or all bad. It's just hard to distinguish who is misinformed and who's informed, who's giving good advice, individual circumstances. It can be a scary place. If you want to go and feel bad, it's a good place to go. If you want to be confused, it's a good place to go. But so I encourage students, like, be very mindful of where you get your advice, the same way you should be mindful of where you hear your news or what you trust, or, all this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I think that it can be sort of a hotbed for anxiety. And so my goal is always to, provide proper education to our students and make sure to, like I said, validate their anxieties. Okay, let's talk about, is this real? Is this not? Why do we think that? And so on. And so there's a lot that goes into, assisting students who might be getting bogged down with what they're reading on forums.
And there you have it, folks. Avoid social networks like the plague. Of course, it's a little more complicated than that, and there's a lot of good that can be had from support and communication with other people. But in general, it seems like a dangerous game to play. Anyway, Dr. Shemmassian, what would you say is the role of an academic consultant?
It's not just about the to-dos. You have to keep students, encouraged, and, be their cheerleader along the way, and, being the figurative shoulder to cry on when things are going bad. Like, all of that I see as our job, and that's the way we like to support our students.
I know when I was personally going through the MCATs and thinking about reapplying for myself personally, I never really feared about taking the MCATs again, because I genuinely enjoyed the process, which sounds like a very crazy masochistic thing to say. But I know my wallet would suffer greatly from another MCATs test. It's just that financially
it's a beast.
Draining process. I think that also scares students in getting consultants. Am I going to invest in something that I don't even know will bear fruit? Can you go through like an overall process of what your services provide for students?
Sure. Yeah, it is. It's a non-trivial investment, right? So it's these aren't, cheap services or anything like that. I completely understand. Our job is to do, is to assist you with getting into med school, period. From freshman year, develop 4-year course plans, assisting you with identifying whom you might want to get rec letters from eventually, making sure that, you're taking the MCAT at the right time, making sure that we're tutoring you on the MCAT, helping you identify weak areas, both on the side of test content and test strategy, and, delivering live tutoring to see how you end up at wrong answers and your patterns and errors, because everyone has a pattern in errors, whether or not you know it. But beyond that, making sure that on the application, develop an overall application theme. We'll assist you with, brainstorming, outlining, and editing all of your essays from your personal statement, which is the foundation, on down to your work and activities and secondaries. We'll assist with, Casper prep and interview coaching geared towards specific schools. We have a lot of notes about what specific schools look for, and everything, update letters, waitlist letters, letters of intent, whatever the case might be. We help our students with. And it's one of these things where sometimes people wonder, well, can I do it alone? Yeah, maybe, and some students do. The question is, though, like, is it worth it, time and money? I can watch a YouTube video on tiling my bathroom, but I'm probably not going to do it as well. It's going to take me just as much time. I might screw it up. All these kinds of things, right? And so there is a lot of value in making sure that someone who's an expert in this is walking you through it step by step, so you don't miss anything. We were talking before we started recording, Tim. You're like, oh, Casper, I didn't know about that. So, like, these are the things. You don't have to know what to ask, right? Essentially making sure that you have a source you can go to that guides the process. So, of course, I recognize my bias here, but given our students' track record, I feel very confident that, getting the right guidance will be super beneficial to anybody out there.
I think oftentimes when we look at physicians or we look at mentors, we sort of ask them what they can do for their clients, but not often do we ask them what can their clients do for them. So do you have any recommendations for students on how to best capitalize on their consultant agreement? And what personality traits that they should really strive for? Or are there any pet peeves that you've dealt with students where you're like, like I'm gonna have a difficulty with the student?
Biggest thing is trust. I think that sometimes, some of the challenges I've experienced have to deal with, lack of trust kind of thing. No matter how many times you do it, no matter how expert you are, you help someone with an essay, they show a friend gives their opinion, student freaks out. And that's the thing. And then, you have to make sure, obviously to develop, rapport, that there's a trusting relationship, all this kind of stuff. But if you keep showing it to people, get different feedback, you can say, oh, are you sure you said it was okay? This other person didn't say it's okay. And that you can start spinning your wheels. Or, something else apply to this schools. Well, online I looked at, this school looks for this and I'm worried. I don't think so it's more so about, when you hire an expert, if there's trust there, follow the lead is my advice, right? Because chances are we're considering variables you might not have. You can ask questions about why we recommend certain things. I think that's a great thing to do, but ultimately we're here to help and we have your best interest at heart. And so, my advice would be to put yourself in their hands, and listen to the guidance, because if you do, chances are you're going to be all right.
So for real, we just got to trust. Diligence and practice precedes rationality, and sometimes you just got to do what you're told. Given the vulnerable nature of a student-tutor relationship, it's easy to see how someone might be combative or prideful. It's honestly so difficult to wrestle with your self-image when you're potentially not outputting the best of scores and etc. But sometimes it is best to just trust that your instructor has your best interest. Of course, we should always stay inquisitive and ask questions, but perhaps you could frame it in a way that isn't accusatory or defensive. Ultimately, you getting a better score is a battle that your instructor and yourself do together. So, some cohesion and peace is warranted.
What's the hardest part of your job?
Hardest part of my job? It's more so being willing to assist students with the emotional distress in addition to the application. The application know-how is the know-how. Done it so many times and know every nook and cranny of the application. But for that student, it's their first time. Or if they're a reapplicant, it's their second time, which is in some ways more stressful. And so putting aside my perspective and experience in some ways of like, I know they're going to be fine, but you don't want to just say like, you're going to be fine. God, you don't have to worry, all that kind of stuff. Being in there with them and sort of having empathy is what it comes down to, understanding what their experience is. Yeah, you might have done it 1,000 times, multiple thousands of times, but for them, it's the first time and it's their life. It's not an idea to them. It's their life. And not that it's hard to do that for me. It's just something that I like to remind myself all the time.
And Dr. Shemmassian brings up a point that I wrestle with a lot, and that is the pursuit of consistency. In every interview question where I've been asked, what do you think is going to be the hardest part of this job or this profession? I never really state the logistical concerns or time demands, but I always refer to the concept of resetting myself every day and approaching every day and every interaction with my best. And I think I'm slowly beginning to transition my perspective of this reality is not daunting, but rather exciting. I love it.
I know that you personally, from my superficial research, are a food connoisseur. You like food. And so I was wondering maybe if you could walk the walk and try to somehow craft your love of food and dishes into a potential works and activities that or like how would you frame that? How would you work that into your application so that you could get accepted into a hypothetical medical school?
So first things first, you don't want to oversell stuff when you talk about a hobby. What do I like? If it feels forced, like I love eating different, ethnic foods, and this has given me access to, diverse peoples, which is the type of work I want to do as a doctor. Like a for, like lifting weights, and the commitment I have to weightlifting has really taught me that, that all good things are hard and require, like becoming a physician will be
easier.
Yeah, like that kind of cheesy thing. So don't do that.
Right.
So be a person. Like if you're going to talk about a hobby, just talk about what you enjoy about it. Be a person. Like imagine you met, so I sometimes treat it as like, imagine you met this person at the AdCom at a cafe, and they're like, oh, like, what are you drinking? A latte. The reason I like a latte is because it takes a lot of practice to get it right. The milk temperature, the art on the latte. And so this kind of, commitment to excellence is really the kind of commitment I want to show on my way to being a doctor. Like you would never say that to someone at a coffee shop.
Right.
So why would you write that in an application? Right. And so be a person. I probably just talk about where my, interest in food stem from, watching my mom in the kitchen, cooking a lot of like Lebanese, Armenian dishes, and, watching a lot of the Food Network and being exposed to sort of different dishes and wanting to try them all. And then, growing up in LA and how I'm exposed to so many opportunities to eat delicious things, and just how something, I've enjoyed, and people come to me for advice on where to eat. And I love cooking and entertaining. And so just being a person, what does it say about me? I like to explore stuff. I like to taste new things. I like to be hospitable and invite people over and cook me. That's what I would talk about. I wouldn't talk about being a doctor. I'd just be a person. And so just be real is my takeaway from that.
Just be real. Super dope.
Walking the walk. Do you have any slept on dishes that you feel like not many people know about, but definitely deserves more recognition?
As a category, I think ice cream is the best dessert in the world. But a dessert that people might not have tried that I wholly recommend is kunefe. It's basically like a crispy, cheesy, sweet dessert from the Middle East. People should check that out and look for it if they haven't had it.
So your boy isn't the type to just listen to something and not do anything with it. Since Dr. Shemmassian suggested kunefe, I took this opportunity to not only try a new dish and experience, but I also took this opportunity to surprise my girlfriend with a date to a local restaurant and get some brownie points. Anyway, the restaurant is called Alibaba Grill, and it is absolutely great. If you're ever in the Colorado Boulder area, you should definitely stop by. Anyway, I decided to order some meat combo thing, my girlfriend decided to get a vegetarian dish, and then we both decided to get some kunefe per Dr. Shemmassian's suggestion. Here's our reaction to trying kunefe for the first time.
All right, Dr. Shemmassian, we'll see. Oh, dude, this is dope. Yo, that is so good.
So good, and like I've never tried something like this before.
Now, after our first impressions, we decided to have a little food review in my car, so here's the honest review.
Okay, I have a question for you, my love.
What? Can you start the car?
yeah, I can start.
I have a question first. Start the car.
How was the kunefe?
It was really, really yummy, and I liked the stuff on the outside, which I googled, and it said it was shredded dough, and yeah.
I think it was really balanced and it wasn't too sweet. I'm not a sweets person. I'm a savory dude. Do you think that Dr. Shemmassian gave a good suggestion?
I do, yes.
Yeah. Do you think it's better than ice cream?
No.
So Dr. Shemmassian was right on all accounts. All right. You heard it from us. Now, after Dr. Shemmassian and I started talking about great desserts, I eventually got around to the topic of my own lack of success with the application process and wanted to wonder when and how we should get started with the next step.
I personally have not received any interview invitations until, I still haven't. And it's February 21st, 2022. At what point do you feel like, oh man, you should be worrying, or maybe you should just try your hand at consulting?
Immediately. There's nothing good that comes from waiting at this stage. So, if you get, so I think sometimes it's speaking of psychology, I think it's psychologically difficult for some people to start working on their next cycle because it feels like they're throwing in the towel and giving up. But that's not what's going on. You're just, it's like, you still hope that you'll get in this cycle, but you don't want to be in a position where you waited till April, didn't do anything, May's around the corner. You're like, oh, I don't think I'm going to get it. I should get started. Now you're behind the 8 ball. You got to do it quickly. And so my thing is like, what's the harm in moving forward, in thinking about what extracurriculars to strengthen, to writing your essays for the next line? There's no harm. If you get in, Tim, what's going to happen? Let's say you wrote your personal statement again and you ended up getting in. Are you going to say, damn it, I can't believe I wrote another essay. This is the biggest way. You're going to be partying. You're going to be so happy you got in. You're not going to be pissed off about, writing another essay. Right. But on the flip side, if you don't write the other essays and now it's May, you're going to be kicking yourself. Right. And so my advice is move forward, look ahead. By waiting and twiddling your thumbs and clicking on Reddit to see interview updates. And I heard, Rush gave out more interviews, that kind of thing, and holding out hope, whatever. It does you no good. If you're going to get in, you're going to get in. If you're not, you're not. So look ahead always.
What great words of advice. Oftentimes, I really try and reflect on my interactions with my guests, but this one happened to be what I needed in just the right moment. What Dr. Shemmassian said really hit home for me, and maybe that's exactly what some of our listeners, or you, might need to hear right now. In the pursuit of vulnerability, I personally have decided to take my next steps, and literally at the time of writing this script, I just got 2 emails back with regards to 2 medical assistant positions, and I'm super excited to share that with all of you. It just feels like after the battery of COVID in life, feels like I'm finally gaining some movement, and I hope that can happen for you all as well. Anyway, with that being said.
What great words of advice. And then the last question, and a segue to it, is any advice you have in general for medical students that are, or pre-medical students that are currently going through the application process or just trying to pursue medicine in general?
Hang in there is probably my biggest thing. Get good information and hang in there. There are a million to-dos, when you're first year, second year, what clubs to join, what research to do, etc. Take it step by step, find good mentors, ask good questions, develop a plan, and hang in there. It will be stressful. It will rattle your confidence at different stages. Chances are, if you're pre-med, you're probably at or near the top of your high school. All those things are true. But, being pre-med can kind of throw you for a loop sometimes. And so you're going to have to develop that resilience. Get good information, stick to a plan, and hang in there.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shemmassian.
My pleasure.
This was so awesome.
Thank you,
so
Tim.
much.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
In conclusion, we learned about the crazy paths that our lives can ultimately follow by gaining insight on Dr. Shemmassian's own journey to becoming an academic consultant. We learned more about not isolating people or reducing people to their conditions. We talked about the grayish approach to mental health with your application and the ever complicated yet present conversation about reverse discrimination. We went over the power of an internal locus of control. We learned to try and avoid using social media for information, but instead have learned to refer to certified and professional consultants. We discussed the role of an academic consultant and the need for students to trust their mentors and guides. We touched on the topic of consistency and its difficulty. We figured out that we just need to catch our breath and make the next move because the time is now. And we got to do all of that while also getting some brownie points with the lady friend. Thank you all for listening to today's podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, hit the like button, comment, subscribe, rate. It really helps. If you didn't enjoy the podcast or you just feel like some constructive feedback is warranted, please also comment below. Anyways, this is the Asclepius podcast with your host, Slipathy Shu. The next episode we'll be talking about what it's like to be a radiologist with guest speaker Dr. Nancy, MD. Super stoked for this one.